In the quiet town of Willow Creek, Oregon, nestled between rolling hills and dense pine forests, life moved at a gentle pace like the lazy flow of the creek that gave the town its name. The air carried the scent of damp earth and cedar, and the streets were lined with modest homes, their porches adorned with rocking chairs and flower baskets. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other's names, where neighbors swapped stories over coffee at Millie's Diner, and where the annual Harvest Festival was the biggest event of the year. But beneath the town's cozy charm struggles lingered especially for Daniel Harper, a 34-year-old auto mechanic who lived in a small, weathered house on Maple Lane. Daniel was a man with rough hands and a tender heart. His life shaped by two things: his love for his 6-year-old daughter Emma and the weight of raising her alone after his wife Clara passed away from cancer 3 years earlier. Emma was a tiny girl with messy chestnut hair and brown eyes that sparkled like the polished stones she collected from the creek. She wasn't like other children. Despite her frail frame and the asthma that gripped her lungs during the cold, damp Oregon winters, Emma had a gift, a way of sensing people's pain, of making them feel seen and understood, with just a smile or a kind word. Neighbors often remarked on how she'd sit with a crying friend at the playground, whispering stories that turned tears into giggles, or how she'd hold an elderly woman's hand at church, leaving them inexplicably lighter. Daniel didn't fully understand it, but he knew his daughter was special, a bright light in a world that often felt heavy. Every morning, Daniel woke at 4:30, the sky still dark, to make breakfast for Emma before heading to his job at Thompson's auto shop on the edge of town. He'd fry eggs, toast bread, and pour orange juice into Emma's favorite blue cup, the one with a chipped handle and a faded cartoon duck. He'd kiss her forehead, his calloused fingers brushing her hair, and promise to be home by dinner. "You be strong today, my little artist," he'd say, smiling as Emma clutched her sketchbook, where she drew pictures of flowers, animals, and imaginary worlds filled with color. Her asthma was a constant worry, though. The cold months brought coughing fits that woke her in the night, her small chest heaving as she struggled to breathe. Daniel would sit by her bed, rubbing her back, singing old folk songs Clara used to love, like Wildwood Flower, until her breathing eased. The inhalers and nebulizer treatments that kept Emma alive were expensive, costing more than Daniel's weekly paycheck. He'd sold his old pickup truck, pawned his grandfather's pocket watch, and skipped meals to stretch their budget, but it was never enough. The pharmacy on Main Street, with its bright fluorescent lights and rows of medicine bottles, felt like a fortress he couldn't breach without cash he didn't have. One bitter November morning, with frost coating the windows and the thermometer dipping below freezing, Emma woke up gasping. Her face was pale, her lips tinged blue, and her small hands clutched her chest as she whispered, "Daddy, it hurts." Daniel touched her forehead, his heart lurching at the heat radiating from her skin. She was burning up, her fever spiking dangerously. Panic surged through him like a cold wave. "Hold on, sweetheart," he said, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. He rummaged through the medicine cabinet, finding only an empty inhaler and a half-used bottle of fever reducer from last winter. He needed albuterol for her nebulizer and a new inhaler, but his wallet held just $12, barely enough for a loaf of bread and milk. The hospital 10 miles away would demand insurance papers he didn't have, and the pharmacy wouldn't extend credit. Not again. Daniel called his boss, Jim Thompson, begging for an advance. "Daniel, I'm sorry," Jim said, his voice heavy over the phone. "Company policy. No advances, you know that. Times are tight for everyone." Daniel sank to the floor beside Emma's bed, watching her struggle, each breath a shallow wheeze. Her eyes fluttered, half-closed, and she whispered, "Daddy, I'm scared." The words broke something inside him. He couldn't lose her, not after losing Clara. He wouldn't let his little girl slip away because of money. That evening, as Emma drifted into a fitful sleep, Daniel made a choice that felt like betraying everything he stood for. He was a good man, honest to a fault, the kind who returned extra change at the grocery store and helped neighbors fix their cars for free. But love made people do desperate things. He pulled on his worn denim jacket, kissed Emma's fever-hot forehead, and stepped out into the chilly night. The streets of Willow Creek were quiet, the only sound the crunch of leaves under his boots. Thompson's auto shop where he worked was dark, its neon sign flickering weakly. Daniel knew the shop kept spare parts in the back filter's belts, and, crucially, a fuel pump that could fix the town's only ambulance, which had been out of service for weeks. The hospital had been begging Jim to repair it, but the part was expensive, and Jim was waiting for a bulk order to save costs. Daniel's plan was reckless, but clear. Take the fuel pump, fix the ambulance, and barter with the hospital to get Emma's medicine in exchange. He wasn't stealing, he told himself, just borrowing to save his daughter. Using his employee key, Daniel slipped into the shop, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The air smelled of oil and metal, familiar and comforting. He found the fuel pump on a shelf, a small metal piece worth $200 more than he could afford. His hands shook as he tucked it into his jacket, guilt gnawing at him. He wasn't a thief, but Emma's blue lips haunted him. He worked quickly, driving to the hospital's garage where the ambulance sat, and installed the pump under the cover of night. His hands moved with the precision of years spent under hoods, and within an hour, the ambulance roared to life. Daniel drove it to the hospital's emergency bay, left a note explaining the repair, and asked for medicine for Emma. But as he stepped out of the garage, a security guard's flashlight caught him. "Hey, stop right there!" The guard shouted, his voice sharp. Daniel froze, his heart pounding. "I'm not stealing," he stammered, holding up his hands. "I fixed the ambulance. My daughter needs medicine." The guard, a middle-aged man named Carl with tired eyes, shook his head. "You took parts from Thompson's. I saw you on the security camera. I gotta call the cops." Daniel's knees buckled as he thought of Emma alone at home waiting for him. "Please," he begged, tears stinging his eyes. "She'll die without it." Carl's face softened, but he dialed the police anyway. "Sorry, man. It's the law." Within minutes, sirens wailed through Willow Creek, red and blue lights flashing against the quiet streets. Daniel was handcuffed, his head bowed as neighbors peeked out from their windows, whispering. The news spread like wildfire. Daniel Harper, the hard-working widower, had stolen from his own workplace. Mrs. Evelyn Foster, a kind-hearted farmer who lived next door, found Emma alone, coughing weakly, and rushed her to the hospital. Doctors stabilized her with a nebulizer, but they warned Mrs. Foster that Emma might need foster care until Daniel's case was resolved. Daniel sat in a holding cell, his mind racing with fear for his daughter. He hadn't seen her since the arrest, and the thought of her in a stranger's home made his chest ache. The next morning, he was brought before Judge Eleanor Ramsey, a woman known for her sharp mind and unyielding commitment to the law. Eleanor, in her late 50s, sat in a wheelchair behind the bench, her gray hair pulled into a tight bun. 3 years earlier, a fall during a solo climb on Mount Hood had left her paralyzed from the waist down. Since then, she'd buried her pain in her work, becoming Willow Creek's strictest judge, her rulings as precise as the mountain trails she once loved. The courtroom was packed, the wooden pews filled with townsfolk, some there to support Daniel, others to see justice served. Eleanor's gavel struck, silencing the murmurs. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Eleanor Ramsey," the bailiff called. Though Eleanor remained seated, her hands steady on the armrests of her wheelchair. The prosecutor, a young woman named Laura Bennett, presented the case with clinical precision. "Mr. Harper committed theft," she said, her voice echoing. "He stole a fuel pump valued at $200 from Thompson's auto shop, a clear violation of Oregon law. While we sympathize with his motives, the law doesn't bend for personal hardship." Daniel's public defender, a frazzled man named Tom Wheeler, argued passionately, "Your Honor, Daniel Harper is a single father who acted out of desperation to save his daughter's life. He has no prior record and repaired a vital ambulance for our community." Eleanor listened, her face unreadable. She'd heard sob stories before, desperate parents grieving spouses, but the law was her anchor, unmoved by emotion. Just as she prepared to speak, the courtroom doors creaked open. Every head turned as Mrs. Foster entered, holding the hand of a small girl in a faded green dress. Emma's brown eyes scanned the room, landing on her father, Daddy. She called, her voice clear and bright, cutting through the tension. She broke free from Mrs. Foster and ran to Daniel, her sneakers squeaking on the polished floor. The bailiff moved to intercept, but Eleanor raised a hand. "Let her go," she said softly. Emma threw her arms around Daniel, who knelt to hug her, tears streaming down his face. "I'm so sorry, Emma," he whispered. "Daddy didn't mean for this to happen." Emma pulled back, her eyes shining. "It's okay, Daddy. You were trying to make me better." The room was silent, the air heavy with emotion. Even Laura, the prosecutor, shifted uncomfortably, her notes forgotten. Emma turned her small frame facing the towering bench. She looked up at Eleanor, unafraid, and said, "Judge Lady, my daddy's not a bad man. He took that part because I was sick and he loves me." Eleanor leaned forward, her stern expression softening. "I understand, sweetheart, but stealing is against the law, even if it's for a good reason." Emma nodded as if she'd expected this. Then she did something no one anticipated. She stepped closer, her tiny hands gripping the edge of the bench, and said, "Judge Lady, I can see you're sad inside, like your heart's stuck in a dark place. If you let my daddy go, I promise I'll help you find the light again. I'll help you walk." The courtroom erupted. Gasps, whispers, and a few stifled laughs filled the air. Laura objected, calling it absurd, while Tom looked stunned. But Eleanor didn't laugh. She stared at Emma, her breath catching. For 3 years she'd lived in a world of pain and resignation, her legs as still as her hope. Doctors had told her she'd never walk again, that her spinal cord was too damaged. Yet something in Emma's eyes, a quiet, unshakable certainty, stirred a feeling Eleanor had long buried. Order. Eleanor banged her gavel, silencing the room. She looked at Emma, then at Daniel, who sat frozen, his face pale. "Young lady," she said, her voice steady but softer than usual, "you're making a very big promise. Do you understand what it means to keep a promise?" Emma nodded solemnly. "Yes, ma'am. I always keep my promises. I know I can help you because I see the light in you, even if you don't." Eleanor's hands tightened on her armrests. Her mind screamed that this was impossible, that a child couldn't heal paralysis, that she was a judge, not a dreamer. But her heart, buried under years of grief, whispered something else. What if this girl was right? What if there was a chance, however small? The room held its breath, waiting for her decision. "Mr. Harper," Eleanor said, her voice carrying through the courtroom, "you've committed a crime, and the law demands consequences. However, your daughter has made an extraordinary claim." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Laura stood, her mouth open to protest, but Eleanor raised a hand. "I'm going to do something unprecedented. I'm postponing your sentencing for 30 days. If your daughter can fulfill her promise, I'll consider dismissing the charges. If not, you'll face the original theft charge, plus additional penalties for misleading this court. Daniel's face fell, the weight of the gamble sinking in. Emma, though, smiled brightly. "Don't worry, Daddy," she whispered, squeezing his hand. "It's gonna be okay." As the bailiff dismissed the court, people filed out buzzing with disbelief and curiosity. Some called Emma a dreamer, others a fraud, but a few, like Mrs. Foster, looked at her with quiet hope. Daniel and Emma walked out into the crisp Oregon air, hand in hand. "Emma," baby Daniel said, kneeling to her level, "what you did was brave. But what if you can't help the judge? What if we're making things worse?" Emma's eyes sparkled, undaunted. "Daddy, remember what Mommy used to say. The light's always there, even when it's hard to see. Judge Ramsey's light is just hiding, and I'm going to help her find it." Daniel hugged her, tightly torn between fear and awe. Across town, Eleanor sat alone in her chambers, staring at a faded photo of herself on Mount Hood, standing tall against the sky. For the first time in 3 years, she felt a flicker of something unfamiliar hope. And in her desk drawer, tucked among legal files, was a small, colorful drawing Emma had slipped her before leaving the courtroom, a field of wildflowers under a glowing sun, with the words, "Find your light," scrawled in a child's handwriting. The morning sun filtered through the towering pines of Willow Creek, Oregon, casting dappled light across the gravel driveway of Mrs. Evelyn Foster's farm. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of hay and blooming lavender from the fields that stretched behind her weathered red barn. Daniel Harper stood on the porch of Mrs. Foster's farmhouse, his hands stuffed in the pockets of his faded jeans, watching his 6-year-old daughter Emma skip toward the horse paddock with a sketchbook tucked under her arm. Her chestnut hair bounced in a loose ponytail, and her brown eyes sparkled with a quiet confidence that both amazed and terrified him. The past week had been a whirlwind since the courtroom scene, where Emma had boldly promised Judge Eleanor Ramsey, a woman confined to a wheelchair for 3 years after a climbing accident, that she could help her walk again. Daniel still couldn't wrap his head around it. He was a man of wrenches and engines of things he could touch and fix, not miracles or promises that defied medical science. Yet here he was, temporarily free from jail, living under Mrs. Foster's roof, while Emma tried to fulfill an impossible vow. The judge's decision to give them 30 days hung over him like a storm cloud. A fragile hope tied to his daughter's unshakable belief. Mrs. Foster, a spry woman in her late 60s with silver hair and a warm smile, had taken Daniel and Emma in after the trial. Her farm, just outside Willow Creek's main strip, was a haven of rolling pastures, grazing horses, and rows of sunflowers that Emma adored. "You two need a place to breathe, Mrs." Foster had said, her voice firm but kind, when she'd found them packing their sparse belongings from their rented house. No child should be worrying about courtrooms or foster care, and no father should face jail for loving his daughter too much. Daniel had tried to protest, but Mrs. Foster's stubborn generosity won out. Now, as he watched Emma kneel by a fence post sketching a horse with her colored pencils, he felt a mix of gratitude and dread. The town was buzzing about Emma's promise. Some called it a child's fantasy, others a miracle in the making. Daniel didn't know what to believe, but he knew one thing: Emma was his world, and he'd do anything to keep her safe, even if it meant trusting her wild, impossible dream. Inside the farmhouse, Mrs. Foster was frying bacon, the sizzle filling the kitchen with a comforting aroma. "Daniel, you gonna stand out there brooding all day?" she called through the open window. "Come eat. Emma's got a big day ahead." Daniel sighed, running a hand through his dark hair, and stepped inside. The kitchen table was set with plates of eggs toast and a jar of homemade blackberry jam. Emma bounded in her sneakers, muddy from the paddock, and plopped her sketchbook on the table. "Look, Mrs. Foster," she said, flipping open a page to reveal a drawing of a chestnut mare with wings soaring over a field of golden flowers. "This is Starlight, and she flies to the moon when nobody's watching." Mrs. Foster chuckled, her eyes crinkling. "Well, that's the prettiest flying horse I ever saw. You gonna show that to Judge Ramsey when she comes today?" Daniel froze his fork halfway to his mouth. "She's coming here today, Mrs." Foster nodded, wiping her hands on her apron. "Called this morning. Said she wanted to meet Emma somewhere less courtroomy. I suggested the farm. Figured the fresh air might do her good." Daniel's stomach churned. Judge Eleanor Ramsey, with her sharp gaze and reputation for unyielding fairness, was coming to this farm to meet his daughter. The same judge who'd spent 3 years in a wheelchair, her life reshaped by a fall on Mount Hood that crushed her spine and her spirit. The same judge who'd gambled her courtroom's dignity on a 6-year-old's promise. He glanced at Emma, who was humming as she added a crescent moon to her drawing. "Sweetheart," he said carefully, "what exactly are you going to do with Judge Ramsey today?" Emma looked up, her brown eyes bright. "We're going to be friends, Daddy. You can't help someone if you don't know their heart, and I'm going to show her the light inside her, the one she forgot about." Daniel forced a smile, but his mind raced. What if Emma couldn't deliver? What if the judge's patience ran out? The thought of losing Emma to foster care, or worse, facing harsher charges, made his chest tighten. At 2:00 p.m., a black SUV pulled into the farm's driveway, kicking up dust. Eleanor Ramsey, dressed not in her judge's robes, but in a simple gray sweater and slacks, maneuvered her wheelchair down a portable ramp with the help of her assistant, a young man named Greg. Her face was guarded, her gray eyes scanning the farm with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Emma ran to meet her, unfazed by the judge's stern demeanor. "Hi, Judge Eleanor," she called, her voice as bright as the sunflowers behind her. "I'm so glad you came. Want to see the horses?" Eleanor's lips twitched, almost a smile. "Hello, Emma," she said, her voice softer than in the courtroom. "Horses, huh? I haven't been near one in years." Emma grabbed a basket of carrots from the porch. "Come on, I'll show you Starlight. She's the best listener, except when she's dreaming about the moon." Daniel watched his heart in his throat as Emma led Eleanor toward the paddock, Greg pushing the wheelchair over the uneven ground. The paddock was a wide fenced area where 3 horses grazed, their coats gleaming in the afternoon light. Starlight, a gentle chestnut mare, nickered as Emma approached, holding out a carrot. "See, Judge Eleanor, you just hold it like this," Emma said, demonstrating. Eleanor hesitated, then took a carrot, her hands steady but cautious. Starlight nibbled it gently, and for the first time Daniel saw a flicker of wonder in Eleanor's eyes. "She's beautiful," Eleanor murmured, stroking the mare's muzzle. Emma grinned. "She likes you. Horses know when someone's got a good heart, even if it's hiding." Eleanor's expression faltered, a shadow crossing her face. "My heart's been hiding a long time, Emma," she said quietly. "Ever since I fell on that mountain." Emma tilted her head, studying the judge. "You didn't just fall, did you? You got scared and part of you stayed up there on the mountain?" Eleanor stiffened her hands, gripping the armrests of her wheelchair. "How could you know that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Emma didn't answer directly. Instead, she pulled out her sketchbook and flipped to a new drawing, a mountain under a starry sky, with a tiny figure standing at the peak, arms raised. "This is you," Emma said, pointing. "Before you got hurt, you loved climbing mountains because they made you feel free. I bet you still dream about them." Eleanor stared at the drawing, her eyes glistening. "I used to climb every summer," she said, her voice thick. "Mount Hood was my favorite. The day I fell, I was alone, pushing too hard." I thought I could conquer anything. Now, I'm stuck in this chair, and I haven't felt free since." Emma reached out her small hand, resting on Eleanor's. "You're not stuck, Judge Eleanor. Your legs are sleeping, but your heart can still climb mountains. I'm gonna help you remember how." For the next hour, Emma and Eleanor stayed by the paddock, feeding the horses and talking. Emma told stories about flying horses that carried dreams to the stars, her words painting vivid pictures that made Eleanor laugh, a sound so rare it startled Daniel, who watched from a distance. Mrs. Foster joined them, bringing a thermos of chamomile tea and a plate of oatmeal cookies. "You're a natural with the horses, Judge," she said, winking at Emma. "This one's got a way of bringing out the best in folks." Eleanor took a cookie, her guard lowering. "You know I used to ride when I was a girl," she said. "Back then, I thought I could gallop across the world." Emma's eyes lit up. "You can still gallop, just in a different way. Like with your heart." Eleanor chuckled, but there was a spark in her eyes, a hint of the woman who'd once scaled peaks. As the afternoon wore on, Emma suggested they plant some flowers in Mrs. Foster's garden. "Flowers are like little pieces of light," she said, handing Eleanor a packet of sunflower seeds. "When you plant them, you're telling the world you believe in tomorrow." Daniel helped set up a small raised garden bed near the paddock, low enough for Eleanor to reach from her wheelchair. Emma showed her how to press the seeds into the soil, her small hands guiding Eleanor's. "You gotta talk to them," Emma said seriously. "Tell them to grow big and strong." Eleanor raised an eyebrow, but played along, whispering to the dirt, "Grow tall, little ones." Emma giggled, clapping her hands. "Perfect. Now they'll be the biggest sunflowers ever, because you told them to." That evening, after Eleanor left, Daniel tucked Emma into bed in the farmhouse's guest room, a cozy space with quilted blankets and a window overlooking the fields. "Emma," he said, sitting on the edge of her bed, "you were amazing today, but are you sure about this? Helping Judge Ramsay walk? It's a big promise." Emma yawned, clutching her sketchbook. "Daddy, it's not about her legs, it's about her heart. When she remembers how to be happy, her legs will wake up. I saw it today," she smiled, "and that's the start." Daniel kissed her forehead, his heart heavy. He wanted to believe her, but the ticking clock of the 30-day deadline loomed. If Emma failed, he'd face jail, and she'd face a future without him. The next day, Emma had an idea. "Daddy, can we have a horse riding day for the kids in town? Judge Eleanor can come watch, and it'll make her feel part of something." Daniel hesitated, but Mrs. Foster loved the idea. "Let's do it," she said. "It'll bring some life to this farm." They spread the word, and by Saturday the farm was buzzing with children from Willow Creek, their laughter echoing as they took turns riding Starlight and a gentle pony named Clover. Emma ran the event like a tiny ringmaster, helping kids onto the horses and handing out carrots. Eleanor arrived, her wheelchair positioned near the paddock, a cautious smile on her face. The sight of the community kids giggling, parents cheering, Mrs. Foster passing out lemonade, seemed to soften her. Emma ran over, handing her a daisy. "This is for you," she said. "It's from the field where Starlight dreams." Eleanor tucked the flower into her sweater, her eyes misty. "You're something else, Emma Harper," she said. As the kids rode, Emma sat beside Eleanor, telling her about each child: Tommy, who was shy but loved drawing; Sarah, who wanted to be an astronaut; and little Ben, who'd lost his dog last month and still cried at night. "They all have light inside them," Emma said. "Just like you." Eleanor watched the children, her expression distant. "I used to feel that light," she admitted. "Before the accident, I thought I could do anything. Now, I don't know who I am anymore. Emma squeezed her hand. You're still you, Judge Eleanor. You're the lady who climbed mountains and loved horses. We're going to find her again, I promise. That night after the kids left and the farm quieted, Eleanor sat in her SUV staring at the daisy in her lap. She hadn't felt this alive in years, not since the wind on Mount Hood used to whip through her hair. When she got home, she wheeled herself to her bedroom and opened a dusty box under her bed. Inside were photos of her climbing days, her standing triumphant on peaks, her face radiant. For the first time in 3 years, she didn't shove the box away. Instead, she lingered on a photo of herself on Mount Hood, smiling under a starry sky. And then, in the stillness of her room, she felt a faint twitch in her left foot. She gasped, staring at her legs, unsure if it was real or a trick of her mind. She didn't tell anyone, not even her assistant Greg. But as she closed her eyes that night, she saw Emma's drawing of the mountain and the tiny figure standing tall. For the first time since her fall, Eleanor Ramsey dared to dream of climbing again, even if just in her heart. The skies over Willow Creek, Oregon, had been restless all week, with gray clouds piling up over the pine-covered hills like a warning. By Friday evening, the air was thick with the promise of a storm, the kind that rattled windows and sent horses skittering in their paddocks. Daniel Harper stood on the porch of Mrs. Evelyn Foster's farmhouse, his eyes scanning the darkening horizon. The past 2 weeks had been a strange mix of hope and fear, since Emma, his 6-year-old daughter, had promised Judge Eleanor Ramsey she'd help her walk again. Emma's bright brown eyes and unshakable belief had already worked small miracles. Eleanor's guarded smiles, the twitch in her foot, the way she'd laughed while feeding horses at the farm. But the 30-day deadline loomed, and Daniel's heart was a tangle of pride for his daughter, and dread for what might happen if she failed. Inside, Emma sat at the kitchen table, her sketchbook open to a new drawing, a stormy sky with a single star shining through, surrounded by flowers that looked like they were dancing in the wind. "This is for Judge Eleanor," she said, her voice cheerful, despite the distant rumble of thunder. "It's to remind her that light comes even when it's stormy." Daniel forced a smile, but his hands clenched. He wanted to believe in Emma's gift, but the world didn't run on drawings and dreams. Mrs. Foster bustled in, her silver hair pulled back, carrying a tray of hot cocoa. "Storm's coming," she said, glancing out the window. "Big one by the look of it. Hope the barn holds up." The farm, with its sprawling fields and old red barn, was Mrs. Foster's pride. But the barn's roof had been leaking, and the wooden beams were starting to rot. Daniel had been helping her patch it up, but they hadn't finished before the weather turned. Emma sipped her cocoa unfazed. "The horses will be okay, Mrs. Foster. Starlight told me she's not scared of storms." Mrs. Foster chuckled, ruffling Emma's hair. "That mare's got more sense than most folks. You keep listening to her, sweet girl." Daniel watched his daughter, marveling at her calm. Since the courtroom, Emma had spent every day with Eleanor at the farm, planting sunflowers, telling stories about flying horses, and drawing pictures that seemed to carry a magic all their own. Eleanor, once stern and distant, had softened her gray eyes, brighter, her laughter more frequent. But Daniel couldn't shake the fear that it wasn't enough. If Emma's promise fell short, he'd face jail, and Emma could end up in foster care. Saturday morning broke with a howl of wind, the storm hitting Willow Creek like a freight train. Rain lashed the farmhouse and thunder shook the walls. Daniel woke to find Emma already dressed, pulling on her yellow raincoat. "I'm going to check on Starlight," she said, her voice firm. She might be scared now. Daniel grabbed his jacket. "Not alone, you're not." It's too dangerous out there." They stepped into the downpour, the wind whipping their faces as they ran to the barn. Inside, the horses were restless, snorting and pawing the ground. Starlight nickered as Emma approached, stroking her muzzle. "See, Daddy? She's okay, but she says the barn's creaking too much." Daniel frowned, hearing the groan of the old beams above. "We need to get back to the house," he said, but before they could move, a sharp crack split the air. A section of the barn roof caved in wood, splintering as rain poured through. Daniel grabbed Emma, shielding her as debris fell. "We're okay," he panted, checking her for injuries. But the barn was a mess, and the horses were panicking. Mrs. Foster appeared soaked to the bone, her face pale. "We've got to get the horses out," she shouted over the storm. Daniel and Emma helped lead Starlight and the others to a sheltered paddock, the rain stinging their skin. As they secured the gate, a car pulled into the driveway, Eleanor's black SUV. Greg, her assistant, helped her out holding an umbrella as she maneuvered her wheelchair through the mud. "What are you doing here?" Daniel yelled, his voice nearly lost in the wind. Eleanor's face was set, her gray hair plastered to her forehead. "Mrs. Foster called, said the barn was in trouble. I'm not useless. You know I can help." Daniel stared, stunned. The judge who'd spent 3 years walled off by her injury was here in a storm, determined to pitch in. Emma ran to her, grinning despite the chaos. "Judge Eleanor, you came to save the horses." Eleanor's lips twitched. "Something like that, Emma. Let's get to work." They moved to the barn where Mrs. Foster was trying to salvage tools and feed from the wreckage. Eleanor, from her wheelchair, directed Greg to move buckets under leaks, her voice steady despite the storm's roar. Emma stayed close, handing her a tarp to cover a pile of hay. "You're brave, Judge Eleanor," Emma said, her eyes shining. "Like when you climbed mountains." Eleanor shook her head, rain dripping from her hood. "I'm just trying to keep up with you, kid." But as they worked, a gust of wind slammed into the barn, loosening another beam. It swung down narrowly, missing Mrs. Foster. Eleanor, closest to the danger, pushed her wheelchair forward to grab a rope tied to the beam, hoping to stabilize it. "Eleanor, no," Daniel shouted, but it was too late. The wheelchair hit a slick patch of mud, tipping over. Eleanor fell, her head striking a wooden post with a sickening thud. She lay still, rain pooling around her. "Judge Eleanor." Emma screamed, dropping to her knees beside her. Daniel and Mrs. Foster rushed over, their hands shaking as they checked for a pulse. It was faint, but there. "She's alive," Daniel said, his voice hoarse. "We need an ambulance." Mrs. Foster ran to call 911, while Daniel lifted Eleanor's limp form, carrying her to the farmhouse. Emma clung to her hand, tears mixing with the rain on her face. "Don't go, Judge Eleanor," she whispered. "Your light's still here." The ambulance arrived, its sirens cutting through the storm, and paramedics loaded Eleanor onto a stretcher. Daniel and Emma followed in Mrs. Foster's truck, the rain blurring the windshield as they sped to Willow Creek General Hospital. The waiting room was cold, the fluorescent lights harsh against the worry etched on everyone's faces. Word of the accident spread, and soon the room filled with townsfolk, Millie from the diner, Jim Thompson from the auto shop, even Laura Bennett, the prosecutor, from Daniel's trial. They sat in tense silence, the storm raging outside. Dr. Margaret Lee, a no-nonsense physician with a reputation for bluntness, emerged after an hour. "Judge Ramsey has a severe concussion," she said, her voice grim. "She's unconscious, and there's swelling in her brain. The next 24 hours are critical. If she doesn't wake soon, we could be looking at permanent damage." Daniel's heart sank, his mind flashing to the courtroom deal. If Eleanor didn't recover his freedom, and Emma's future was at risk. But more than that, he felt a pang of guilt. Eleanor had come to the farm to help, inspired by Emma's hope, and now she was fighting for her life. Emma, though, didn't waver. She stood her small frame resolute and said, "Dr. Lee, can I see her? I can help her find her way back." The doctor frowned, adjusting her glasses. "Sweetie, she's in the ICU. No visitors, especially not children." Daniel put a hand on Emma's shoulder. "Maybe we should wait, Emma." But Emma shook her head, her eyes fierce. "Daddy, her heart's lost like it's stuck in a storm. I can sing to it like Mommy used to sing to me when I was sick. I know the song she needs." Laura Bennett, who'd been listening quietly, stepped forward. "Dr. Lee, I was in the courtroom when this girl made her promise. I thought it was nonsense, but something about her changed, Judge Ramsey. If there's even a chance she can help, isn't it worth a try?" The room murmured in agreement, faces hopeful and skeptical. Mrs. Foster nodded. "Let the girl try, Margaret. What's the harm? Science isn't doing much for Eleanor right now." Dr. Lee sighed, rubbing her temples. 5 minutes, that's it. "And you two," she pointed at Daniel, "and Mrs. Foster go with her." Emma nodded, clutching her sketchbook, and followed the doctor down a sterile hallway to the ICU. The room was dim, filled with the hum of machines. Eleanor lay in a hospital bed, her face pale tubes snaking from her arms. Emma climbed onto a stool beside her, her small hand resting on Eleanor's. "Judge Eleanor," she said softly, "it's Emma. I know you're scared like you were on the mountain, but I'm here, and I'm gonna sing you home." Emma began to sing, her voice clear and sweet. A folk song Mrs. Foster had taught her about the Oregon hills through the pines, and the river's bend, "There's a light that never ends." The words floated through the room, gentle but powerful, like a breeze cutting through fog. Daniel watched his throat tight as Emma sang, her eyes closed, her hand never leaving Eleanor's. "Your heart's not lost, Judge Eleanor," she said between verses. "It's just hiding in the storm. Remember the horses, the sunflowers, the kids laughing at the farm. That's your light." Dr. Lee, standing by the monitors, gasped softly. Eleanor's heart rate erratic before began to stabilize. Her fingers twitched just slightly under Emma's touch. "She's responding," Dr. Lee whispered, her voice incredulous. Emma kept singing, her voice unwavering. "Follow the star through the rain and cold. It'll lead you where the heart calls home." Outside, the storm was easing, the rain softening to a drizzle. In the waiting room, the townsfolk had gathered closer, some holding hands, others whispering prayers. Millie from the diner brought coffee, her eyes red from crying. Jim Thompson. Daniel's boss clapped him on the shoulder. "Your girl's something special," he said gruffly. "I should have given you that advance." "I'm sorry." Daniel nodded, too choked up to speak. Back in the ICU, Emma finished her song and leaned closer to Eleanor. "You're almost there," she whispered. "See the star in my picture? It's shining for you. Follow it back." She pulled out her sketchbook, placing the drawing of the stormy sky and the single star on Eleanor's chest. The monitors beeped steadily, and then slowly Eleanor's eyelids fluttered. Her gray eyes opened, confused, but clear, focusing on Emma. "Emma," she croaked, her voice weak. Emma's face lit up. "You're back. I knew you'd find the light." Daniel rushed to the bedside, tears streaming down his face. Dr. Lee checked Eleanor's vitals, her expression a mix of shock and wonder. This shouldn't be possible," she muttered. Eleanor blinked, trying to piece together the fragments of her memory. I was in the barn, she said slowly. The storm? I fell. And then I was lost, like I was back on Mount Hood in the dark. But I heard your voice, Emma, singing about a star. I followed it, and it brought me here. Emma smiled, her eyes shining. That's your heart, Judge Eleanor. It's stronger than any storm. Dr. Lee shook her head, scribbling notes. Her vitals are stable. No signs of brain damage. I don't understand it, but she's awake. Daniel hugged Emma tightly, his heart swelling with pride and relief. Mrs. Foster wiped her eyes, whispering, That's my girl. But the moment was bittersweet. Eleanor's recovery was a miracle, but the 30-day deadline still hung over them. Would she walk, as Emma promised? And if she didn't, what would become of Daniel and his daughter? As the hospital room filled with the soft glow of hope, the storm outside faded, leaving only the promise of a new day and a test that was far from over. The morning sun rose over Willow Creek, Oregon, painting the rolling hills in shades of gold and amber, as if the world itself was celebrating a new beginning. The storm that had shaken the town just days ago had passed, leaving behind a crisp clarity in the air and a renewed sense of hope among the townsfolk. At Mrs. Evelyn Foster's farm. The fields were still damp, but the sunflowers Emma had planted with Judge Eleanor Ramsey stood tall, their bright petals reaching for the sky. Daniel Harper stood in the farmhouse kitchen flipping pancakes for Emma, who was coloring at the table, her sketchbook filled with drawings of stars, horses, and fields that seemed to glow with an inner light. The past 3 weeks had been a roller coaster, Emma's bold promise in the courtroom, her quiet moments with Eleanor at the farm, and the heart-stopping night when Eleanor fell during the storm, only to wake from a coma to Emma's song. Now, with only a few days left in the 30-day deadline, Daniel's heart was a knot of hope and fear. Emma's gift had already done the impossible, bringing Eleanor back from the edge, but the judge's promise to walk again and Daniel's freedom still hung in the balance. Emma, though, seemed untroubled, humming, as she drew a picture of a tree with roots that stretched deep into the earth. "This is for Judge Eleanor," she said, her brown eyes bright. "It's going to remind her she's strong like a tree that grows through storms." Mrs. Foster bustled in, her silver hair tied back, carrying a basket of fresh eggs. "You two ready for today?" she asked, her voice warm, but tinged with anticipation. Eleanor was coming to the farm again, her first visit since the accident. The whole town was talking about her recovery, how she'd woken from a coma, how her vitals had stabilized against all odds. Some called it a miracle, others luck. But those who'd seen Emma in the hospital singing to Eleanor's still form believed in the little girl's gift. Daniel set a plate of pancakes in front of Emma, his hands unsteady. "Sweetheart," he said, sitting across from her, "you've done so much already. Judge Eleanor's awake and she's getting better. But walking, that's a big promise. Are you sure?" Emma looked up her pencil, pausing. "Daddy, it's not just about her legs. It's about her heart remembering who she is. When she does, her body will follow. I saw it in the hospital. She's close." Daniel wanted to believe her, but the weight of the deadline pressed on him. If Emma couldn't deliver, he'd face jail, and Emma might be taken away. He forced a smile, kissing her forehead. "I trust you, my little artist." At noon, Eleanor's black SUV rolled into the farm's driveway, the gravel crunching under its tires. Greg, her assistant, helped her out, but this time Eleanor wasn't in her wheelchair. She leaned on a sturdy cane, her movements slow but deliberate, her gray eyes sharp with determination. The townsfolk who'd gathered Millie from the diner, Jim Thompson from the auto shop, even Laura Bennett, the prosecutor, gasped softly. Eleanor's legs, once lifeless, were moving, her steps shaky but real. Emma ran to her, her green dress fluttering. "Judge Eleanor, you're walking!" she cried, clapping her hands. Eleanor's lips curved into a rare, full smile. "Not quite running a marathon yet, Emma," she said, her voice warm, "but I'm getting there, and I owe it to you." Daniel watched his throat tight as Emma took Eleanor's hand, leading her to a bench near the sunflower garden. The crowd followed their whispers, a mix of awe and disbelief. Eleanor sat, her cane resting beside her, and looked at Emma. "When I woke up in the hospital," she said, her voice carrying across the quiet farm, "I felt something I hadn't in years: hope. Your song, Emma. It wasn't just music. It was like a map guiding me back from a place I'd been lost in since my accident." She paused, her eyes glistening. "And then, the next day, I felt my legs. Not just a twitch, a real sensation like they were waking up." Dr. Margaret Lee, who'd joined the gathering, shook her head, her arms crossed. "I've run every test," she said. Her spinal cord damage was severe, irreversible by all medical standards. Yet she's regaining movement. "I can't explain it." Emma grinned, unfazed. "It's not about fixing broken things, Dr. Lee. It's about fixing broken hearts." Judge Eleanor's heart is waking up, and her legs are listening. The crowd murmured, some nodding, others still skeptical. Laura Bennett stepped forward, her face softer than it had been in the courtroom. "Judge Ramsey," she said, "I doubted you when you made this deal with Emma. I thought it was reckless. But seeing you now, I was wrong." Eleanor nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I doubted myself too, Laura. For 3 years I let my accident define me. I thought justice meant following rules, not feelings. But Emma showed me there's more to it: compassion, hope, second chances." She looked at Daniel, who stood with Mrs. Foster, his hands in his pockets. "Mr. Harper," she said, her voice firm but kind, "all charges against you are dropped. Permanently." The crowd erupted in cheers, and Daniel's knees nearly buckled with relief. He knelt beside Emma, hugging her tightly. "You did it, sweetheart," he whispered, tears in his eyes. But Eleanor wasn't finished. "There's more," she said, raising a hand to quiet the crowd. "Daniel, you risked everything for your daughter. That's not a crime. It's love. I've spoken with Jim Thompson and the hospital board. They're offering you a job as head mechanic at Willow Creek General with full benefits, including health insurance for you and Emma." Jim stepped forward, his gruff face apologetic. "I should have helped you sooner, Daniel. This job's yours if you want it." Daniel's voice caught. "Thank you, Judge Ramsey." "Jim, I don't know what to say." Emma tugged his sleeve, grinning. "Say yes, Daddy." The crowd laughed, and Daniel nodded, his heart lighter than it had been in years. Emma, though, had one more idea. "Judge Eleanor," she said, holding up her latest drawing, the tree with deep roots, "I think we should have a big day at the farm where everyone can come and draw and tell stories. It'll help people find their light, like you did." Eleanor smiled, her cane tapping the ground. "I love that idea, Emma. Let's make it happen." Over the next week, Mrs. Foster's farm transformed into a festival of color and community. Townsfolk brought paints, canvases, and instruments, setting up under the sunflowers. Emma led a group of kids, teaching them to draw light pictures, images of stars, flowers, and dreams. She told stories about flying horses and mountains that sang her voice, weaving magic through the crowd. Eleanor, still using her cane, joined in painting a picture of Mount Hood under a starry sky. "This is for you, Emma," she said, showing her the canvas, "for helping me climb again, even if it's just in my heart." As the festival ended, Eleanor, Daniel, and Emma stood by the sunflower garden, where a small crowd had gathered. Eleanor leaned on her cane, her legs stronger each day, and addressed them. 3 weeks ago, she said, I was a judge who thought justice meant rules and punishment. I'd forgotten what it felt like to hope to believe in something bigger. Emma Harper taught me that justice isn't just about laws, it's about people, their struggles, their love. She showed me that a child's heart can heal what doctors can't, that compassion can mend what rules can't fix. She looked at Emma, her eyes warm. This little girl didn't just help me walk. She helped me live again. The crowd applauded, some wiping tears, others hugging neighbors. Millie from the diner whispered to Mrs. Foster, "That kid's gonna change this town." But the true moment came as the sun dipped low, casting a golden glow over the farm. Emma led Eleanor and Daniel to a patch of earth near the paddock, where a young oak sapling waited its roots wrapped in burlap. "This is our miracle tree," Emma said, her voice bright. "We're going to plant it together, so everyone knows miracles grow when we believe in each other." Daniel dug the hole, his hands steady despite the emotion welling inside him. Eleanor, leaning on her cane, helped Emma lower the sapling into the earth, their hands brushing the soil. The crowd watched silent as they patted the dirt down, sealing a promise. "This tree's gonna grow big," Emma said, looking up at Eleanor. "Just like your heart." Eleanor smiled, tears streaming down her face. "And yours, Emma. Always yours." 6 months later, Willow Creek had changed. Eleanor walked into her courtroom, her cane a quiet companion, her steps surer with each passing day. The townsfolk greeted her with smiles, not just as a judge, but as a woman who'd faced her darkness and found light. Daniel thrived at his new job, his toolbox now in a hospital garage, where he fixed ambulances and vans with pride. Emma's medical bills were covered, her asthma managed with regular treatments, and she spent her days at the farm teaching kids to draw and tell stories. The oak sapling grew its leaves, catching the Oregon sun, a symbol of the town's renewed spirit. At a quiet ceremony, Eleanor married Dr. Margaret Lee, who'd fallen in love with her strength and rediscovered joy. Emma, as flower girl, scattered sunflower petals down the aisle, humming her folk song about the light that never ends. As the wedding guests danced under fairy lights strung across the farm, Emma leaned against Daniel, her eyes on Eleanor, and Margaret swaying slowly. "Daddy," she whispered, "do you know the best part about miracles?" Daniel smiled, brushing her hair. "What's that, sweetheart?" Emma's face glowed. "When people see one happen, they start believing in all kinds of wonderful things. And when they believe wonderful things happen all the time." Daniel hugged her close, thinking of Clara's words. "The light's always there, even when it's hard to see." Looking at his daughter, at Eleanor, dancing at a community knit together by compassion, he knew Emma was right. Miracles weren't just moments, they were seeds planted by love, growing wherever belief took root. The lesson was clear, etched in every heart that day. True justice balances rules with empathy, seeing the person behind the crime. Emma taught Willow Creek that healing, whether of bodies or spirits, comes from connection, from listening to each other's pain, and daring to hope. Children with their unfiltered faith can remind adults of what matters most, love's second chances, and the courage to plant a seed even in the stormiest ground. As the stars rose over the farm, Willow Creek stood stronger, its people bound by a little girl's gift, and a promise that grew into a miracle.